Um, but I think we can draw some ideas and make some ideas of how it works. I think the nature of the Oman foreign policy has been impacted definitely by international, regional, and domestic factors. Um, Aspects such regime security, state security have always been and will always continue to be the determinant, if you like, force for the direction of Oman foreign policy. Um, but that's alone doesn't really explain everything. I think the other thing that we really to look at is the Omani society, history, political culture, and the leadership perception, as well as the economic position of Oman. I think all of these factors have coalesced to produce what we now term as kind of a unique Omani foreign policy. So I'm afraid we'll have to kind of go back to the old analysis and apply the three levels of analysis, domestic, regional, and international. Um, so as a small country, and again, I say that with trepidation after the definition of the earlier speakers about small country. Oman has always tried to balance these interests, the national interest, the regional interest, and of course, uh, the international interest and international powers interest in the region. And it's always in constant balancing game, hence the term omni-balancing. In this sense, we can talk about how Oman and Saudi Arabia are both members of the GCC, and Oman has cooperated with Saudi Arabia, but also cooperate with Iran, which is a next door neighbor. So, kind of this perplexes many observers of how can Oman maintain this relationship. Although Oman is not the only member of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is a regional organization, and it's not the only state that doesn't follow, if you like, the GCC foreign policy, and some of them have diverged sometimes in their policies, like Qatar, for example, we just talked about, but even the Emirates and other states, Bahrain. Many of the Gulf states have diverged because although the GCC is a regional organization that gets all these countries together, it hasn't really kind of evolved into a political union, and therefore foreign policy is still very much determined by member states. But it doesn't follow strictly the policies, but it has been able to maintain its position within the GCC as one of the founding members and also a very important member of this organization. And now just give you an example of some of these policies that Oman, foreign policies that Oman diverted a little bit from the GCC. For example, Oman was one of the very, very few Arab countries that supported the Egyptian-Israeli peace process in the 1980s, as well as the subsequent peace accords between Jordan and Israel. And Oman did not cut the relationship with Egypt, and all the other countries, Arab countries, or most of them did except Sudan, and continued to have good relationship with Egypt. Now, despite the good relationship also with the Shah of Iran, because he did help Oman to quell the revolution in the southern part of Oman, where I actually come from, Oman has been able to conduct good relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran after the overthrow of the Shah. During the Iran-Iraq War in 1980s to 88, most of the Arab countries, especially the Gulf countries, supported Iraq in the war, and financially, etc. Oman did not side with the other side and play a very constructive mediating role between them to end the war. At the same time, Oman kept its relationship with Baghdad and did not withdraw its ambassador following the election of what some people consider a sectarian government in Iraq. Oman also did not interfere in the Syrian crisis and kept its diplomatic relation going there. Um, and Oman also had some very interesting relationship with Iran and helped to negotiate the release of some Western hostages at the time. And for many of you would know that Oman was behind secret diplomacy that led to the GCPOA, which was mentioned earlier, which is the Joint Action Program, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or the nuclear deal, which is now, of course, in a difficult situation due to the American president withdrawing from it. And hopefully the Europeans will be able to keep it alive. At the same time, Oman has supported the GCC and worked very hard to make sure that cooperation continues. But on the other hand, they did not want to be part of the monetary union that the GCC has proposed, nor did they want to be part of the political union that was proposed by King Abdallah. And it's always been trying to reconcile the GCC and Iran differences on the Yemen war. Oman did not participate, of course, with the other members of the GCC that did go to war. And it's hosting dialogue at the moment between the Houthis and other factions, trying to end the humanitarian crisis there. When it came to the blockade of Qatar, Oman, of course, regretted what happened to a member state of the GCC. They didn't think that this serves the interest of the region, and they have been trying to support Kuwaiti efforts in resolving the crisis. Oman has also played a very important part, although quietly in the background, in supporting the Middle East Peace Initiative, in whether it was the Madrid and the Oslo Accords, but even now, many of you must have heard about the Netanyahu's visit to Oman, which was quite an interesting move by Oman to invite Netanyahu to Muscat. So what does explain this? Why does Oman have continues to follow these policies? What explains the Omani foreign policy? I think, we can talk about, of course, the geopolitics, the geographical location. We can talk about its history. And, of course, demographic and social contexts are very important. Economic and natural endowment and leadership reception. And I'll talk briefly about all of those. Oman, as you know, has a very... is located at the east of the Arabian Peninsula, or the southeast, close to Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc. So its location is very important. It also had a very important trading history, and at the same time, it was at one point it was a colonial power as well that had a relationship in East Africa. And because of time, I will try and limitation. I'll try and go very quickly. Oman is also a country that has a very mixed society. So I will not use the PowerPoint. So don't follow that. Let's just wash my lips. Oman also has a very interesting mixed society. Small population, about 4 million. Almost 1 million are foreigners. But the population itself is of different background, and we have in Oman a different sect of Islam that doesn't exist anywhere in the Arabian Peninsula, at least. It exists in North Africa. but very, very small minority called Abadism, and Abadism has been prosecuted throughout their history by the Islamic states. And they found a refuge in Oman, and they have been able to practice their beliefs. And they are, because of their history, because they have been prosecuted, it's built in their DNA. They are very peaceful people. They just want to survive, and they want to live with other people. And although they are not a majority, there is also, of course, a Sunni population and a small Shia population, but the overall concept of peaceful coexistence, I think it's part now of the makeup, the personality makeup of the people. Oman is challenged economically. It doesn't have the resources that other Gulf states, Qatar, Emirates do, and therefore it doesn't tend to kind of follow very expensive foreign policies and expensive political maneuvers. Will Oman be able to maintain its independent and unique foreign policy in lieu of what we now see as regional polarization? That's a question that we really ask ourselves. And given also the changes in the international context, with the new administration in the US, etc., and given the economic challenges that Oman and social challenges that Oman is facing, as well as succession issues, because the Sultan is aging and there is a talk about whether he will, there is issues with succession because he hasn't appointed the heir or the next Sultan. So these are big questions that people ask, and some people think that this effect and the Omani foreign policy making and Omani foreign policy orientation. I don't think this is going to happen, because the answer is most likely Oman will not change all of this. Of course, leadership perception is important. The Sultan himself is a very central role of Oman foreign policy. But as I explained earlier, the society, the culture, the geostrategic consideration of Oman is very, very important. And we could have what you have explained earlier, a differentiated neutrality, but will not move away from the fact that Oman wants to see the region around it, but also the world, living in a peaceful existence. I know that you might think this is a little bit idealistic, but why not? I think we've seen so many crises in the region, and it's lovely to see a country that actually works for peace and acts for it as well, and do the talking as well. And thank you very much for your patience, Fanar.
Thank you very much, Abdallah. Our next speaker is Ranj Alaaldin, who is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. He was previously a visiting scholar at Columbia University and specialized in interstate conflict, governance, and human security issues in the Middle East and North Africa region. He currently focuses on post-conflict reconstruction, proxy warfare, security sector reform, and peace building in conflict. He led election monitoring and fact-finding teams in Iraq between 2009 and 2014, as well as in Libya during the 2011 uprising. And today he will be speaking about the securitization of small states and security interdependency. Ranj?
Thanks very much. As you can see from my one slide there, this will be in stark contrast to the subtle power that Ran and Abdullah have touched on. I'm going to provide a somewhat more, let's say, gloomy take on the issue of small state security. And of course, we can always open that up for discussion in the Q&A session. So let me start off by firstly saying that I think, and this was touched on in the first panel and by Bilahari, in fact, in terms of what is the state, particularly in countries where power and authority is conducted around monarchies, families, tribes, clans in some cases, religion as well. So when we do talk about security, are we talking about the state and the institutions that conduct the business of governance and administration, or are we talking about the particular, let's say, power structures that oversee these institutions? And I think if we want to get to the specifics of small state security, sustainability, that's very important to break down. But also another, let's say, complication would be the emergence over the past 10 years of parallel state institutions. So if you look at Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, you've got certainly the entity, the state, but you also have actors that are conducting the business of governance, of providing security, that are politically integrated into the state, but militarily are very much autonomous. So that's another complication, I would say, moving forward as we address this very important topic. Let me start off by saying that in the literature, as many of you will be familiar with, without an army, you are not a state. This was commonly asserted in the 19th and 20th centuries. There was no sovereignty unless you had that element of self-reliance. And in today's world, I think that's particularly important. And this, of course, goes in contrast, I would say, to Abdullah's remarks about having a neutral actor. Dr. Hines touched on the importance of neutrality, and hopefully at some point we can discuss the importance of having a viable army whilst also staying neutral, given that you're never too far away from a very, let's say, significant, no matter how neutral you might be, no matter how willing you might be to accommodate great power, medium power requests and needs. And of course, in World War II, we all know that a number of countries were neutral, preferred to stay out, but they were caught up in the conflict, in the war, nonetheless, ended up being invaded and occupied. So on the positive side, interstate wars are on the decline. The last interstate war from memory would be the Georgia-Russia conflict. But by contrast, civil wars and terrorist attacks, irregular warfare, they're on the increase. And I would say they're much more important in today's world because the consequences of civil wars tend to live on in the memories of populations far longer. I mean, that can be contested, certainly, but it has implications for conflict relapse, for the social fabric of these communities. And if you're a small state, a medium power state, great power, that can present certainly threats and challenges, but at the same time, opportunities. And we've seen this with the adventurism of a number of GCC countries in North Africa, and of course, other parts of the MENA region. So there is a worrying trend in that regard that I think has to be accommodated in the discussion and debates on small state security. Now, at the same time, if we're talking about how small states react to these challenges, we've heard things like bandwagoning, free riding, the need for, let's say, being resource rich in order to engage in power projections, to establish deterrence mechanisms. You're also seeing, and I think Rory touched on this in his presentation, certain actors that don't necessarily need to be resource rich, but they can certainly align themselves within coalitions, with great powers on the basis of ideals. So whether that's, as a democracy backing, promoting actor, you might, for example, project secularist ideals in order to align yourself with Western, US or European powers, or putting all that to one side, position yourself as a critical front line in the war against, for example, ISIS, or in the effort to contain Iran. Certainly some GCC countries do that. I don't think Qatar does that in a very, let's say, outspoken way, but nonetheless, in the immediate aftermath of the GCC crisis, there was plenty of voices in DC and elsewhere that highlighted the need for a stable Qatar in order to ensure the anti-Iran containment strategy remains viable. But let's assume it's 1990, and you've got the current security landscape that you do today, regionally, but also internationally, where the concept of collective security has diminished, where the US has abdicated its role as a global leader, where international norms have been eroded. I would very much doubt that if, for example, Kuwait was invaded today by its neighbor Iraq, and if we want to bring things a bit closer to home, if Saudi Arabia and its allies had mobilized tanks into Qatar, notwithstanding the important contribution of Turkey in that regard, whether there would have been the same, let's say, relatively immediate reaction from the international community where you could have passed a Security Council vote in order to forestall the aggression from whether it's Saddam Hussein or whether it's from one of the blockading countries. So when collective security has been diminished, you've now got to ask yourself which institutions or actors will fill the resulting void. China, I think, is still a very untested character in the region, and as far as many people are concerned, certainly has no intention for now of replacing the US, the West, and most certainly not in traditional American backyards. And that, of course, highlights perhaps the futility of having American bases on your territory and whether that can act as a sufficient deterrent mechanism. Wars are fought differently today. They will be fought differently tomorrow. That could be good news for small states because you no longer need to have expensive, expansive armies to conduct the business of security. Now, on the positive side, certainly it's much cheaper. It's more, sometimes, not always, more effective to rely on proxy groups, ragtag groups. But at the same time, you're also contributing to the further erosion of international norms because by engaging these actors, by outsourcing security to these actors, you're contributing to the further erosion of norms and the rules-based international order, which traditionally has been critical for small state security, principles of sovereignty, the need to respect territorial integrity, and so forth. And of course, I think very succinctly in his Q&A remarks, how the UAE has successfully engaged in that form of warfare in North Africa with dire humanitarian consequences, certainly, but it's positioned itself or it's transitioned from a small power to a medium power player in the region. At the same time, Qatar has also used the crisis as an opportunity to project its power. And I think, and I'll come to the point on how small states are sometimes better positioned because I wouldn't say contrary to what Bilahari said, but the significance of institutions in the kind of wars that are being fought today and will be fought tomorrow are very important to factor in. Institutions are critical if you're fighting a conventional war that relies on conventional armed forces and the operational aspects of all that. But if you've got, let's say, a small population mobilized around ideals that create a strong nexus between society and state, I think that's far easier, not easier, but it's a much more straightforward process to satisfy if the state revolves around family, monarchy, tribe, clan, and so forth. These are just some ideas that I'm throwing out there and can certainly be discussed in the Q&A part of this session. But of course, that comes down to your own social base. When you're a small state in today's conflict landscape, the opportunity for outsiders to engage in political subversion, to, for example, mobilize a rebellion, to try and force a coup, to install a client regime, I think you're much more vulnerable to those acts as a small state. So that's the other side, the flip side of the way conflict is conducted today. But nonetheless, that support base internally is a force multiplier. And identity, family, ideologically based rule can sometimes be a very effective way to not only mobilize your population, but also to send a message perhaps to outside aggressors that although they do have far more superior military capabilities, the chances are they will face a war of attrition. So there will not be victory in any sense of the word. Certainly not a clean and uncostly victory. And that again creates a deterrence mechanism for these small states when they come up against middle or larger powers, middle or larger actors. Let me also come back to the comparison between conventional armed forces and irregular warfare. In bigger states, it's much more difficult to adapt to this changing conflict landscape. I spent 2 weeks, 10 days or so in Washington, D.C., speaking to US officials, policymakers, as part of a project we're doing at Brookings on proxy conflict. And you'll be amazed, probably not amazed, in fact, I was amazed at how stifling the bureaucracy and the institutions can sometimes be when it comes to engaging this changed proxy landscape. I mean, I should point out there are large states, such as Iran, for example, that are very effective in doing so. But even then, the state has outsourced that particular need to an autonomous institution. Or put another way, they have given an institution in Iran substantial autonomy to conduct the business of conflict in that sphere. Smaller states with smaller populations are much better positioned to adapt in that regard. And therefore, again, that provides them with a distinct advantage over bigger states in the event there is a conflict or threat of conflict. I think to conclude, I would say from a policy perspective, there needs to be a radical revision, radical reform of the rules and laws that have regulated conflict historically. There needs to be a real discussion when it comes to the role of the UN, of the Security Council, Chapter 7. They are no longer, as far as I'm concerned, fit for purpose in that regard. Notions of sovereignty, transnational conflict comes into that as well. And I think I'll end there, and then perhaps in the Q&A we can continue.
Thank you, Ranj. Thank you. Our final speaker on this panel, Ahmed S. Hashim, is an associate professor in the Military Studies program at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, RSIS, and he specializes in strategic studies. He has worked extensively in the fields of strategy and policy, dealing in particular with irregular war and counterterrorism for the past 20 years, prior to taking up his current position at RSIS in 2011, where he teaches courses on insurgency and counterinsurgency, terrorism, and defense policies. He is the author of several books, including 3 forthcoming books: The Iranian Way of War in the Service of a Nation or a Revolution, that's later this year; Small Wars Too Big to Ignore, also this year; and God, Greed and Guns, State Formation and Nation Building in Iraq, and that's scheduled for publication next year. And today he'll be speaking about the creation of security by small states, a comparative analysis of Singapore, the UAE, and Qatar. Ahmed?
Thank you very much, Fanar, for that kind introduction. I'm going to steal a line from Rory Miller's comment earlier on that this is a project in process, and I just started it in December. And basically, I'm following the flow of trying to see where it actually leads me before I come to some substantive conclusions about the UAE, Qatar, and Singapore. And I could have added other states, but it's I've visited, I live here now. I've visited the UAE on numerous occasions, and Qatar just most recently, my 5th trip there. Mehran was kind enough to invite me to a workshop at Georgetown University. And I saw that as an opportunity to try and get some stuff on Qatari foreign or security policy. The bookstore there was the only place that I had success. I went out into Doha. Most of the bookstores around the hotel really dealt in religious literature, which doesn't interest me one bit. But having said that, let me start with two juxtaposed comments or statements, which basically put it in perspective for me. The cliche of quoting Thucydides, who's more often quoted than read, just like Clausewitz, the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept, contrasting with this anecdotal story from World War II, supposedly. How many soldiers does Switzerland have? Goering asked. 1 million, sir, replied the Swiss soldier. What if Germany sends 2 million soldiers to invade Switzerland? Then each Swiss soldier will have to shoot twice, sir. Which really goes counter to the crude realist or neo-realist view that small states cannot create military power. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the theory. I mean, we've done that in the first panel quite effectively. And of course, I'm going to be using a lot of the small state literature from Annette Baker from 59 onwards to the present in IR. So the study is embedded, very deeply embedded in IR literature. But being a strategic studies student rather than general IR, I'm more focused on how states create security for themselves rather than foreign policy. So I'm switching from the foreign policy to creation of security. And on creating security, there are two aspects to this. So some of the stuff that other members have talked about, which is creating security through alliance systems, bandwagoning, hedging, Omni balancing, and so on, yeah, that's a form of creating security. But there's also creating military capabilities as well. National security policy, defense plan policy, and so on. The two are intricately linked, but one level is blurred into IR and the other is much more embedded within national security studies and strategic studies. I am going to go beyond the realist paradigm, but I will not abandon it. In this light, when I look at the UAE, Qatar, and Singapore, I'm going to examine, and still this is at the early stages, domestic politics, coalitions, and constructivism, because in many ways, Singapore's ability to transcend its structural constraints was constructed. Singapore in '65, as Bilahari said, is not the Singapore of 2019. So on top of realism, because I do believe that military power is an important aspect of state security, but going beyond that, I'm looking at domestic politics coalitions and constructivism. Now, what this project is not, it's not a study of foreign relations of those countries. I'm not going to compete with some of the more accomplished people who are doing this, but it's on national security. And I'm going to be looking at national security, arms acquisition, and defense planning. Now, the literature on small state IR and foreign policy has increased dramatically, notwithstanding the realist tendency, traditional tendency to poo-poo small states and so on. But the literature on small state national security making is even smaller than literature on foreign and IR practice. Now, but there are key concepts that I'm addressing, okay? Some of them are theoretical, merging into the practical. Can a small state become a small power? Rory Miller mentioned the UAE becoming a middle power. I think it transformed from a small, because you know when we talk about small states, we don't call them small powers. That's in contrast to great powers, superpowers, middle powers. I think it's trying to leverage to small power status. Singapore has done it. Israel is the only one that has gone from small state to small power to middle power for a wide variety of reasons, including the ability to domestically create military power on its own, plus from external support, but primarily now from its own. It's the only one, and we don't have time to go into this. But how do you explain Israel, Singapore, Taiwan, and the United Arab Emirates who, instead of fatalistically accepting the realist conception that, or the Thucydides paradigm and the realist conception that they cannot create military power. How do you explain that? The second thing that I'm looking at is structure versus agency in the security of small states. In national security, structural factors that impinge on state X can either be constraints or opportunities. Geography, demographics, location and geopolitics, resources, vulnerability versus defensibility. But for small states, structural factors are often more constraints. And this is true in the case of these three countries I'm looking at. Concerns what human beings do to transcend constraints and make most use of opportunities and resources, which leads me to the next conceptual framework that I'm adopting, which is institutionalized versus personalistic national security making. Nature and personality of leader and size of decision-making elite can determine institutionalization versus personalism. But take Iran under the Shah, a big country with one of the most sophisticated militaries in the global South. Yet the Shah and his closest advisor, General Tufanian, liked to make decisions themselves on what Iran would acquire for the imperial armed forces. The apocryphal story is that they would flick through Aviation and Space Technology Weekly, I think it was the name of the, and say, oh yeah, we want this, we want that, so go make it happen. Now, but there were institutions, but because of the Shah's fear of coups and his suspicion of the officer corps, everything was fragmented and often personalized. Other things being equal, the smaller and less advanced your military is, the more personalistic the decision-making in national security. Why these states? Well, I have a personal interest in all three, so that may explain it. But all three are small states. Qatar is a micro-state with small, and they all have small state problems. Former British colonies. I don't know if this has any significance yet beyond Bilahari's comment, or I think Fanar's comment about social disciplining and bureaucracy and so on. I have to see whether this has any further pull. They're surrounded by bigger powers with whom they've had and history. All three have leveraged certain resources available to them to seek, in the cliche, to punch above their weight. Two have non-native populations that outnumber the native populations. One has succeeded in transforming itself from a small state to a small power, namely Singapore. One, the UAE, is trying to do so with its military and growing power projection capabilities. And one, Qatar, will never be able to rely primarily on the military. And this leads me to, and I'm not going to replicate or try and transcend what Mahran said. I agree totally with what his statement, his talk, and I acquired his book and also the recent the new edition. I'm going to look at Qatar as a military power. Studies of its national security are rarer than citing a unicorn. Now, that's not surprising, because when it was engaged in subtle power, it really didn't pay much attention to its military, apart from acquisition of Mirage 2000s and some French armored vehicles in the past and so on. And basically, it just ignored that. Actual situation on the ground is the military continues to be very small and underfunded. It has purchased a large number from 2015, where the largest increases of arms acquisitions in the Gulf. Yet, but these have not yet been integrated into the defense structure. And as far as I can see, there is no discernible institutionalized defense planning process. But Qatar does have it for its gas and oil industry and its other mainly political economy activities. And quickly here, shocks to Qatar: the Arab Spring, the mini crisis of 2014, and the major crisis and blockade, which was a traumatic shock. But Can Qatar generate military power from the current native population of 250 to 400,000 for all the three services? Is it possible in this age of the blurring of the Westphalian, or in the collapse of the Westphalian model of national militaries, and an increase, as you mentioned, in proxy forces, professional mercenaries may come into existence again? I mean, before the Westphalia paradigm, Machiavelli used to complain about mercenary forces, but they were prevalent throughout the 30 Years' War and the warring periods in China in ancient times. Another sensitive issue, could they open up permanent residence citizenship to others on the condition that they serve in the new nationally conscripted system that they keep in mind that according to the World CIA Fact Book, the number of men and women who come of military age in Qatar yearly is not sufficient to provide effective replacement on manning for the Qatari military. I had the figures somewhere, but I've lost them. It's quite pitiful. The question of the effectiveness of the military, of the purchase of 96 fifth generation Typhoon, Rafale, and F-15 QA. The number of ground personnel, support personnel needed will be huge. Maintenance, supply, and logistic issues, interoperability issues will basically ensure that this was not acquired for military effectiveness at the moment, but for political effectiveness. In other words, spread the stake, spread support for Qatar among a set of important allies, which there are it's the United States, France, and Britain. And then, of course, there is the issue of the relationship with Turkey. But I have to move on here and look at what has been referred to as Little Sparta. But let me add the issue here of Little Sparta brings to mind Clint Eastwood's interesting Dirty Harry, A Man's Got to Know His Limitations. And I think they may be trying to punch way above their weight currently. The two most important members, as you'll see, the deciders, the northerly sheikdoms are more socially conservatives and less resource endowed. But the creation of a centralized national armed forces was the brainchild of MBZ and others. He saw, just like Singapore's founding fathers, saw the creation of a national military, centralized national military, as a form of creating national cohesion and unity among those diverse sheikdoms. National security and defense policy are now more institutionalized, and defense planning more bureaucratic and formal, and the most combat active, not necessarily combat effective, but somebody referred to the coalition in Yemen stealing a leaf from the Iran-Iraq war as the inept vice versus the incompetent. Threat perceptions in UAE are quite acute. I've been to the UAE several times. For them, Imperial Iran and Islamic Republic of Iran I heard the constant refrain, Balad Adwaniya, enemy country. Political Islam, internally and externally. In the past, Al-Islah, the local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, had members who held ministerial positions and positions in the military. And so you see here from armed neutrality to alliance-based power projection, reinforcing the alliance system and expanding the security horizons beyond the immediate border of Yemen, the port systems, and so on. And here I'm basically I've run out of time, but very quickly, Singapore, the agile dolphin. Here again, the notion of domestic coalitions and constructivism to transcend what were acute structural constraints on Singapore in '65, when there was actually no Singaporeans per se, as Lee Kuan Yew mentioned on several occasions. It was a melange of Asians, Eurasians, and Europeans living in there. So basically, what influenced them to create the security conception, perceptions of humanity, history, geography and geopolitics, own life experiences, and what can be learned from the experience of others, which was Go Keng Sui's primary concern, to learn from all those countries. And leading us to the grand strategy, which to create an effective national security was essentially designed around what I call transformation, defense and security, and modernization and economic development. And these are linked to these three core national security goals: survival, building the nation of Singapore, which did not exist, and developing Singapore to become a power. And the ways and means, and I'll end here, ensure the goal of survival was essentially initially an alliance system, then the British withdrew, and so on, and then creating from near zero capabilities to one of the most sophisticated military forces in Asia. To ensure nation building, a form of social disciplining, which appeared in Europe in the 17th century. If you read Norbert Elias on how Europe transformed itself in terms of social disciplining, which affected military organizational structure, Lee Kuan Yew talked a lot about social disciplining of Singaporeans. And this sounds odd or ominous. It isn't. Social disciplining occurs in democratic, authoritarian, and totalitarian states. And finally, to ensure economic and socioeconomic development, economic prosperity through outward-looking, export-oriented private sector growth. So for Lee Kuan Yew and the first and second tier of the founders of Singapore, Singaporean nationalism was predicated on economic development, not communal nationalism, because that would have created continue to create the problems that existed in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you.